the last telegraph operator to work the transcontinental line before the federal takeover, died in a nursing home in Boise, Idaho in 1974. His name was Samuel Wickham. He was 79 years old. For 56 years, he never spoke publicly about what he heard on the wires in the winter of 1917. But 3 weeks before his death, he gave a recorded interview to a local history student. That tape sat in a university archive for 43 years. In 2017, a researcher digitizing old oral histories stumbled across it. What Wickham described on that tape doesn't match the story we've been told about early telecommunications. It doesn't match the story about when the electrical grid was built, or how it worked, or what it replaced. Because according to Wickham, the telegraph system in 1917 wasn't tapping into a new technology. It was tapping into something that was already there. If you're interested in stories that challenge the official narrative about infrastructure, energy, and the hidden history of the early 20th century, hit subscribe. I cover suppressed history and revisionist research every single week. Now let's get into what Samuel Wickham actually heard on those lines. Samuel Wickham was born in 1895 in a small town outside of Omaha, Nebraska. His father worked for the Union Pacific Railroad as a track inspector. His mother ran a boarding house for rail workers. By the time Samuel was 12, he'd learned Morse code from the telegraph operators who stayed at his mother's house. They taught him in the evenings after their shifts. One of them, a man named Frank Holloway, told him something Samuel never forgot. Holloway said the telegraph wires weren't just carrying messages. He said they were listening to something. Holloway didn't elaborate. He was transferred to another station 2 weeks later. Samuel didn't see him again. Samuel got his first job as a telegraph operator in 1913 at 18 years old. He was stationed in a small relay office in western Nebraska, halfway between North Platte and the Wyoming border. The office was a wooden shack next to the tracks. There were 2 operators. Samuel worked the night shift. His job was to receive messages coming west from Omaha and relay them to the next station in Cheyenne. Most nights the work was routine: train schedules, freight manifests, personnel updates. But some nights the line would go strange. Wickham described it this way in the 1974 interview. He said the line would start humming. Not the normal electrical hum that all operators were used to. This was different. He said it sounded musical, like a chord being held. He said it would last anywhere from 30 seconds to 5 minutes. During those episodes, he couldn't send or receive standard messages. The normal clicks of Morse code wouldn't come through. But he could hear something else. He described it as rhythmic pulses. Not random static, not interference from another line, pulses that repeated in patterns. He tried reporting it to his supervisor in North Platte. The supervisor told him to clean the relay contacts and check the insulation on the line poles. Samuel did. The humming continued. His supervisor told him it was probably atmospheric interference. Electrical storms could cause strange effects on telegraph lines, especially across the plains. But Samuel said the humming happened on clear nights. No storms, no wind, just the hum and the pulses. In the winter of 1916, Samuel was promoted. He was transferred to a larger station in Rawlins, Wyoming. Rawlins was a critical junction point for transcontinental telegraph traffic. Messages coming from San Francisco, Salt Lake City, and Denver all passed through Rawlins before heading east to Omaha and Chicago. The station had 6 operators working in rotating shifts. Samuel worked the overnight shift, midnight to 8 in the morning. That's when the traffic was lightest. That's also when the line went strange more often. The other operators noticed it too. They didn't talk about it openly, but Samuel overheard conversations. One operator, a man named Ed Callahan, told another operator he'd been hearing voices on the line. Not Morse code, voices. The other operator laughed and said Callahan was hearing crosstalk from a telephone line. But the telegraph and telephone systems used separate infrastructure. They didn't share poles. Callahan didn't bring it up again. Samuel started keeping a journal. He logged every time the line hummed, what time it happened, how long it lasted, and whether he could make out any patterns in the pulses. Over 6 months he documented 73 separate incidents. He noticed they happened more frequently during certain times of the month. Specifically, they clustered around the new moon. He didn't know what that meant, but he wrote it down. On the night of February 14th, 1917, the line went completely silent. This was unusual. Even when there were no messages being transmitted, there was always a baseline hum from the electrical current running through the wire. That night, nothing. Samuel tapped out a test message to the next station east. No response. He tried the station west. No response. He checked all his equipment. Everything was functioning correctly. The wire was live. Current was flowing. But there was no signal. Then the hum started, louder than Samuel had ever heard it. He said in the interview that it was so loud he had to pull the headset off his ears. He could still hear it across the room. The sound lasted for 8 minutes. When it stopped, the line came back. But the signal was different. Instead of the normal clicking of Morse code, Samuel heard a rapid series of pulses. They were too fast to decode manually. He tried to transcribe them, but they were coming in faster than he could write. He grabbed a piece of scrap paper and just started marking down dots and dashes as fast as he could, not trying to translate, just recording the pattern. The transmission lasted 90 seconds. Then it stopped. The line went back to normal. Samuel sat there staring at the paper. He had 4 pages of marks. He tried to decode them later, working through them carefully with a Morse code chart. The patterns didn't match any standard Morse. Some of the sequences were too long. Standard Morse code uses combinations of up to 4 dots or dashes for a single letter. These sequences went 8, 10, 12 marks long. They didn't correspond to any letter, number, or punctuation in the standard code. Samuel folded the papers and put them in his coat pocket. He didn't report the incident. He didn't know what to report. A week later, 2 men showed up at the Rawlins station. They said they were from the regional telegraph office in Denver. They wanted to inspect the equipment. They spent 3 hours going through everything. They asked Samuel if he'd noticed anything unusual with the line recently. Samuel said no. They asked him specifically if he'd heard any irregular signals. Samuel said he'd heard some atmospheric static, but nothing out of the ordinary. The men left. They didn't say what they were looking for. 3 weeks later, on March 8th, 1917, Samuel was working the overnight shift again. The hum started at 2:15 in the morning. This time, it didn't stop. It continued for 40 minutes. During that time, Samuel couldn't send or receive any standard traffic, but he could hear something underneath the hum. It sounded like speech. He couldn't make out words, but the rhythm and cadence were unmistakably human. Someone was talking, or something was playing back a recording of someone talking. Samuel put the headset back on, even though the volume was painful. He tried to focus on the sounds underneath the hum. He started to pick out syllables. The language didn't sound like English. It didn't sound like any language he recognized. When the transmission ended, the line went dead again. Completely silent. After 5 minutes, it came back. Normal signals resumed. Samuel sent a message to the Denver office reporting a 40-minute service interruption due to line failure. He didn't mention the hum or the voice. That morning, when his shift ended, he went back to his boarding house and wrote down everything he remembered hearing. He tried to recreate the syllable patterns. He came up with roughly 20 distinct sounds that repeated in various combinations. He had no idea what they meant. 2 weeks later, the United States entered World War I. On April 6, 1917, Congress declared war on Germany. Within a week, the federal government took control of the nation's telegraph and telephone systems under the Wartime Emergency Powers Act. All private telegraph companies were placed under the supervision of the Postmaster General. Operators were told that all communications were now subject to military oversight. Unauthorized transmissions were a federal offense. Operators were required to report any suspicious activity on the lines immediately. On April 21, 1917, Samuel Wickham received new orders. He was being transferred, not to another station. He was being removed from telegraph duty entirely. The official reason given was a reorganization of personnel to support the war effort. He was reassigned to work as a freight clerk for the Union Pacific Railroad in Ogden, Utah. The reassignment was effective immediately. He had 2 days to report to his new position. He asked his supervisor why he was being pulled from telegraph work. His supervisor said the decision came from the regional office. No further explanation was provided. Samuel packed his things and took the train to Ogden. He worked as a freight clerk for the next 4 years. In 1921, the government returned control of the telegraph and telephone systems to private companies. Samuel applied to return to telegraph work. His application was denied. No reason given. He applied again in 1923. Denied again. He eventually gave up. He spent the rest of his working life in freight offices and rail yards. He retired in 1960. For 56 years, he didn't talk about what he heard on the wires, but he kept the papers, the transcriptions of the strange transmissions, the journal entries logging the incidents. He kept them in a box in his basement. In 1974, 3 weeks before he died, a university student named Martin Kelso came to interview him for an oral history project about early railroad workers. During the interview, Wickham mentioned he'd worked as a telegraph operator before the war. Kelso asked him what that was like. Wickham paused. Then he said he wanted to tell someone what he'd heard before it was too late. The tape recording runs 73 minutes. Wickham describes the humming, the pulses, the voices. He describes the night the line went silent and came back with the rapid transmission he couldn't decode. He describes the men from Denver who came to inspect the equipment. He describes being pulled from telegraph work right after the federal takeover. He also describes something he didn't mention earlier in this video. He describes a conversation he had with another operator in 1916, a man named Albert Voss. Voss had worked the transcontinental line for 12 years. He was one of the most experienced operators in the region. One night, during a slow shift, Voss told Wickham something in confidence. He said the telegraph system wasn't new. He said the infrastructure already existed before the first commercial lines were strung. He said the poles, the right-of-ways, the relay points had all been established long before Western Union or any other telegraph company claimed to have built them. Voss said the companies didn't build the system. They just reactivated it. Wickham asked him what he meant. Voss said there were old lines buried under the new ones. Old ceramic insulators that didn't match anything the modern companies used. Old anchor points that were built into bedrock, not driven into soil. Voss said he'd seen them himself when he'd helped repair a downed line in Nevada in 1904. He said when they dug down to fix the pole, they found another insulator 2 feet below the surface. It was made of white porcelain with markings on it that nobody could identify. Voss said the foreman ordered them to bury it again and not mention it in the repair report. Voss told Wickham the humming wasn't interference. It was the old system still running. He said the telegraph companies had tapped into something that was already transmitting. They didn't understand what it was, but they used it anyway. It made their signals stronger. It extended their range. But sometimes the old system would override the new one. That's what the operators were hearing. Transmissions from something that predated Western Union by decades, maybe longer. Wickham asked Voss if he'd ever reported this to anyone. Voss said he'd tried once, in 1907. He'd written a letter to the chief engineer at Western Union describing what he'd found and what he'd been hearing on the lines. 2 weeks later, he was called into a meeting with a regional supervisor and a man who introduced himself as a federal telegraph inspector. They told Voss his observations were the result of misunderstanding how electromagnetic interference worked. They told him that spreading rumors about unknown transmissions could cause panic among the public and undermine confidence in the telegraph system. They told him if he continued making these claims, he would be dismissed from his position and blacklisted from telegraph work across the entire industry. Voss never brought it up again. Not officially. But Voss told Wickham one more thing before they ended the conversation that night. He said there were others, operators, all along the transcontinental line who'd heard the same things. They didn't talk about it openly, but they knew. Voss said there was a network of operators who kept private logs just like Wickham was doing. They documented the incidents, the patterns, the timing. They compared notes when they could, carefully, informally, during shift changes or at regional meetings. Voss said the goal was to eventually compile enough data to prove the transmissions were real and demand an official investigation. That network dissolved in 1917. When the federal government took over the telegraph system, operators were scattered. Some were reassigned, some were dismissed, some were transferred to military communications work and disappeared into the war effort. The private logs were lost, destroyed, or hidden. Wickham said he tried to find Voss after the war. He wrote letters to the last known address he had. They came back undeliverable. He asked other former operators if they'd heard from Voss. No one had. Voss vanished from the record. The story Wickham told on that tape raises uncomfortable questions. If the telegraph infrastructure predated the companies that claimed to have built it, where did it come from? If operators were hearing transmissions that didn't match any known code, what were they hearing? If the federal government moved quickly to silence operators who reported these phenomena, what were they trying to hide? The standard historical narrative says the transcontinental telegraph was completed in 1861. It says the system was built from scratch by private companies who strung wire across the country, erected poles, and installed relay stations. It says the technology was new, experimental, and represented a leap forward in human communication. But what if that narrative is incomplete? What if the companies didn't build the system? What if they found it? There's evidence that suggests this possibility. In the 1890s, during expansion work on the Southern Pacific Rail line through Nevada, workers reported finding ceramic insulators buried in the desert, far from any known telegraph route. The insulators were made from a type of porcelain that didn't match any American or European manufacturer. They were turned over to the railroad's engineering department. There's no record of what happened to them after that. In 1903, a geological survey team working in Utah discovered a series of stone markers arranged in a straight line across 70 miles of uninhabited territory. The markers were spaced exactly 1 mile apart. Each marker was a shaped granite block, 3 feet tall with a drilled hole at the top. The holes were perfectly cylindrical, 6 inches deep, and appeared to be designed to hold a pole or post. The survey team reported the markers to the U.S. Geological Survey. The report was filed and forgotten. The markers were never excavated or studied. Most of them are still there, buried under sagebrush in the West Desert. In 1911, during construction of a new telegraph relay station in Wyoming, workers excavated the foundation and found a buried stone vault. The vault was sealed with a granite cap. Inside were coils of copper wire, ceramic insulators, and glass battery jars filled with a white crystalline substance. The construction foreman reported the find to the regional telegraph office. A supervisor arrived the next day, inspected the vault, and ordered it resealed. The construction crew was told to build the new relay station directly over the vault and never mention the discovery. The incident was not included in any official construction report. These findings are scattered across archives, forgotten in old geological surveys, buried in railroad construction logs. Individually, they seem like anomalies. Collectively, they suggest a pattern. Infrastructure that predates the official timeline. Technology that doesn't match the historical narrative. Evidence that something existed before the system we're told was built from nothing. The question is, what was it? One possibility is that it was a previous attempt at a telegraph network that failed and was abandoned. Perhaps an earlier company tried to establish a transcontinental line in the 1840s or 1850s and went bankrupt before completing it. But there's no record of such a project, no financial records, no corporate charters, no newspaper accounts of an earlier telegraph venture. Another possibility is that it wasn't a telegraph system at all. It was something else that telegraph companies later adapted for their own use. An energy distribution network, perhaps, a system designed to transmit power rather than information. If such a network existed, it would explain why operators like Wickham and Voss heard transmissions that didn't match Morse code. The system wasn't designed for Morse code, it was designed for something else. The telegraph companies just tapped into it because it worked. This theory aligns with other anomalies in early electrical history. Nikola Tesla claimed in the 1890s that the Earth itself could be used as a conductor for wireless power transmission. He built experimental stations in Colorado Springs and Long Island to test this idea. He believed a properly designed system could transmit electrical energy across vast distances without wires, using the Earth's natural resonance. Tesla's work was shut down in 1905 when his financier, J.P. Morgan, withdrew funding. The official reason given was that wireless power transmission wasn't commercially viable. But Tesla claimed Morgan shut him down because the technology threatened existing infrastructure investments. What if Tesla wasn't inventing something new? What if he was rediscovering something old? What if the system he was trying to build already existed and he'd simply figured out how it worked? That would explain why his experiments worked. It would also explain why they were shut down. If a functioning wireless power grid already existed, buried and forgotten, and Tesla had found it, the financial implications would be catastrophic. Every power company, every electrical utility, every infrastructure investment based on wired power distribution would become obsolete overnight. The timing is significant. Tesla's work was shut down in 1905. By 1910, telegraph operators across the western United States were reporting strange phenomena on the lines: humming, voices, transmissions that didn't match any known code. In 1917, the federal government seized control of the entire telegraph and telephone network. Operators who reported anomalies were removed from duty. Private logs were confiscated or destroyed. The official explanation was wartime security. But the war ended in 1918. The federal government didn't return control of the communications network until 1919. And even then, operators who'd reported anomalies before the war were blacklisted from telegraph work. Why? One explanation is that the government discovered something on those lines during the takeover, something they didn't want the public to know about. If the telegraph system was tapping into a pre-existing infrastructure, a network that wasn't built by Western Union or any modern company, the implications would be profound. It would mean the technology we attribute to the late 19th century actually came from somewhere else. It would mean the story of American industrial progress, the narrative of invention and expansion, was built on a foundation that wasn't ours to begin with. Samuel Wickham died 3 weeks after giving that interview. The tape sat in the university archive until 2017. When it was finally digitized and made available to researchers, it attracted attention from a small group of historians and independent researchers interested in alternative infrastructure history. They started looking for corroboration. They found some. A telegraph operator named James Milford, who worked the line in Montana in 1915, left a diary that was donated to a local historical society in the 1960s. In the diary, Milford describes hearing musical tones on the line that lasted for minutes at a time. He describes trying to report them to his supervisor and being told to stop making frivolous complaints. Another operator, Catherine Doane, one of the few women working in telegraph during that period, wrote a letter to her sister in 1916 describing voices she heard on the wire late at night. She said the voices sounded like they were speaking English, but the words didn't make sense. She said it sounded like someone reading a list of numbers and place names, but the place names weren't any towns she recognized. The letter was preserved in a family collection and surfaced at an estate sale in 2003. These accounts, combined with Wickham's testimony, paint a picture of a phenomenon that was widespread but systematically suppressed. Operators across the network were experiencing the same things. They tried to report it. They were silenced. When the federal government took control in 1917, the suppression became official policy. The question is why? If these were just electromagnetic anomalies, why the coordinated effort to silence anyone who talked about them? Why remove experienced operators from duty? Why blacklist them from future work? The most straightforward explanation is that the government knew what the operators were hearing and didn't want it investigated. They knew the telegraph system was tapping into something it wasn't supposed to tap into. They knew the infrastructure predated the official timeline, and they knew that if the public found out, it would raise questions they couldn't answer. Questions about where the technology came from, questions about what else might be buried under the country, questions about who built it and why. There's a broader pattern here that connects to other suppressed infrastructure history. In the late 1800s, there were widespread reports of advanced buildings, exhibition halls, and civic structures that were torn down shortly after being built. The official explanation was that they were temporary structures built for world's fairs and expositions, but photographs show permanent construction, stone foundations, elaborate facades, infrastructure that wasn't designed to be temporary. Most of these buildings were demolished between 1900 and 1920. The materials were buried or destroyed. The official records were vague about why. During the same period, there were reports of old rail lines being dug up and replaced, not because they were worn out, but because they didn't match the new standard gauge. But when workers excavated these old lines, they found infrastructure that didn't match anything in the historical record. Stone roadbeds, metal rails made from alloys that weren't commercially available. Anchor points built into solid rock. These findings were noted in construction logs but never officially investigated. In the 1920s, during the expansion of the electrical grid, workers reported finding buried cables in remote areas far from any known settlement. The cables were insulated with a rubberized material that didn't match any known product from that era. They were traced back to junction boxes made of cast metal with markings that nobody could identify. The cables were cut and removed, the junction boxes were buried. The incidents were recorded in field reports but never followed up on. All of these events, scattered across 30 years and thousands of miles, point to the same conclusion. There was infrastructure in place before the official systems were built. That infrastructure was discovered during expansion and construction projects. It was documented by workers and operators who encountered it. And it was systematically hidden, removed, or destroyed by the organizations and government agencies that controlled those industries. The telegraph operators heard the echo of that system. The humming, the pulses, the voices were transmissions from a network that was still active, still running underneath the modern infrastructure. The operators didn't understand what they were hearing, but they knew it wasn't supposed to be there. When they tried to investigate, they were silenced. When the federal government took control in 1917, they had the authority to make that silence permanent. Samuel Wickham's testimony is the most detailed account we have of what those operators experienced. It's not proof of a conspiracy. It's not evidence of a lost civilization. But it is evidence of something that doesn't fit the official story. It's evidence that the people who built America's communication infrastructure encountered something they didn't expect. And instead of investigating it, they buried it. The question is, what else is buried? What else did they find that we're not being told about? And what's still down there, humming under the lines, waiting for someone to listen?